Welcome. The City of Pittsburgh's Black History Month honors the spirit and contributions of the Vashon family. We're highlighting the enduring legacy of abolitionists and activists of the 1800s. The impact continues to motivate contemporary movements for justice and equality. Underscoring the quest for human rights remains an ongoing journey through education, advocacy, and activism. We're here with Paul Thornell, the great-great-grandson of John B. Vashon and George B. Vashon. And we're celebrating the tribute to the Vashon family with this Black History Month in February 2026. Paul, thank you for being here. And I would just love you to introduce yourself and share a little bit about who you are.
Great, thank you. Well, I'm so appreciative of your putting a spotlight on my three greats-grandfather, John B. Vashon, and his son, my great-great-grandfather, George B. Vashon. I grew up in the Washington, D.C. area, but would frequently go visit my grandparents who lived outside of Philadelphia in the Bryn Mawr area, where my mother grew up. So I've mostly spent my years in the D.C., or I went to college at the University of Pennsylvania, so I'm a lot of years in the Commonwealth. I'm excited to be visiting with you all. I work now as a partner at a bipartisan government affairs firm in Washington, where I've been for a handful of years. Previously, I worked at Citigroup, the world's most global bank, and doing government affairs for them. I worked at United Way of America, where I led their public policy work, and previously worked in government in the U.S. Senate for the Democratic leader at the time, and in the White House under President Clinton. I worked for Vice President Gore. So I've had a very D.C.-focused career in and around Congress and the administration. I also spent a decent amount of my time doing work as board chair of the longtime civil rights think tank, the Joint Center for Political and Economic Studies, an organization founded in the years after the civil rights movement to focus attention on issues of importance through research and convening that impact Black communities. Certainly a number of things that on my formal day job, but also on the sort of mission side of the ledger, as I call it, and excited to be with you today.
Yeah, so it sounds like the family's legacy has really kind of shaped your passion and career and some of those life choices. Anything you would like to share about that?
Oh yeah, it certainly has. At an early age, it was passed down, not so much in a browbeating way, but education was such a fundamental value of our family that my parents and grandparents, kind of just through their experiences, created an atmosphere where that was just a sort of table stakes, and both in terms of figuring out the best way for ourselves, my brothers and I, to leverage the educational opportunities we have, but also recognizing just in the generations before us how educational opportunities for Black Americans was a key part of the work that George B. Vashon, my great-great-grandfather, did. And that was really the person who a lot of the attention of family history, my family history, has been focused around. There are others, prior descendants, and certainly in the years since. But the life of George B. Vashon really is reflective of the commitment to educational excellence, both for him, but also for opening up those educational doors for many Black Americans who in the 19th century were not allowed the typical channels to pursue their educational pursuits. And George B. Vashon was really in the vanguard of pushing forward on the securing rights and educational opportunities for more Black Americans, and a lot of it was done through the written and spoken word, and that's something that's been passed down in the years since, that I'm proud that it's something that at an early age was a sort of realization for me, and tried to do that in many ways in my life.
Yeah, and so those amazing accomplishments going back to the history of George Vashon a little bit, and also John. I know in some of the material I have read, they really emphasize the fact that these men had jobs for 800 men. I mean, they did so much and they contributed so much. Are there a few things that you would like to highlight in those achievements?
Yeah, I think especially as it relates to their years in Pittsburgh, John B. Vashon was a veteran of the War of 1812. He fought in the War of 1812 and was actually captured and was a prisoner of war for 2 years. And he was traded for a white British soldier. And that it was a moment that certainly for him, in the early years of this country, he was a free black. He was born free. And he was certainly fighting for to maintain the independence of this country in the War of 1812, and that action, sort of being traded for a white British officer, there really was no more explicit manifestation of the equality that he carried with him, and moved forward in his life. He moved to Carlisle, Pennsylvania after the war, and then to Pittsburgh. George B. Vashon, his son, was born in Carlisle. And I think one of the things that early on John B. Vashon recognized, one was that his place was in fact in this country, meaning there was certainly a notable movement among both black abolitionists and white abolitionists that certainly many fought to end slavery, but there was a bit of a break in some communities in the abolitionist world, where there were some who viewed that blacks should be freed and go colonize African nations in Africa, and that's where the better path was for them. It was pretty simple in the mind of John B. Vashon, where he sort of looked at his circumstance like, look, I fought for this country. I was captured. I was a prisoner of war for 2 years. I'm not going anywhere. This is my home. I fought for it and I secured its independence. And that was something that I think early on set him on a path to making sure that the country was going to be a place, and he was going to have to, both through his work and the work of his children, work toward a more perfect union, because it certainly wasn't that in the 1820s, 30s, and 40s. When they were beginning their years in Pittsburgh. So he, as I mentioned before, education was a key part of it. He made sure his children, George B. Vashon and his daughter, Mary Frances, had access to and built schools. It wasn't really the case that you could, as a black citizen anywhere, you couldn't just sort of send your children to the public schools. You had to create it out of whole cloth in many ways. And so John B. Vashon started a school. George B. Vashon, his son, went there. And when George B. Vashon was about 16, he'd really exhausted all of the educational pursuits in the Pittsburgh area, and he went to Oberlin. Oberlin College at the time was the first school to let in blacks and women, and George B. Vashon was the first black to graduate that, and probably about the fifth or sixth black to graduate college anywhere. There were a few other schools that had admitted and graduated blacks in the 1820s, 30s. But when George B. Vashon graduated in 1844, he was the first to do so at Oberlin College, and which was certainly a very notable institution in that right, and really began a path continuing on the work of his father, who he saw from an early age. George saw his father, John, being a leader in the abolitionist movement through the business that he ran. He ran a bathhouse. It was the first public bathhouse in Pittsburgh, and would also have a barbershop services tied in with it. And so in the day, it accommodated blacks and whites, and at night, very regularly, there would be slaves coming through as it was a stop on the Underground Railroad.
Hmm.
John B. Vashon was a conductor of sorts, as was George. And this was something that, that Pittsburgh, situated where it is, was kind of a gateway to the West and Ohio, but also north to New York and Canada. And so there was a lot of activity in that part of the Commonwealth at the time. And John B. Vashon was really the leading Black businessman. And a lot of these efforts required money, whether it was financing William Lloyd Garrison, the noted white abolitionist, his newspaper, The Liberator. So much communication. We don't think of it today, but so much communication just in and around the abolitionist movement was it was required almost that they communicated through newspapers and newsletters. There's no internet, of course. There's very few channels to communicate. That's why the Liberator and other papers like Frederick Douglass's The North Star, it was critical, but they needed resources, and so John B. Vashon financed that. You also had to pay a lot of times support slaves, runaway slaves. And so I share all this just to give a bit of a view as to what things were like in and around Pittsburgh and the world that George B. Vashon grew up seeing through his dad's work, and that he took on in different ways. After he finished at Oberlin, he studied law under Walter Forward, who was a judge in the Pennsylvania area and the former Secretary of Treasury. Sat for the bar, was denied admission because he was Black, and then went to New York and decided he would move to Haiti. But on his way to Haiti to be a professor at a college there, he took the bar in New York and passed it, and became the first Black lawyer in New York. Some years later, my uncle, Nolan Atkinson, he and I worked together to posthumously get George B. Vashon admitted to the Pennsylvania bars. So technically, he's the first Black lawyer in New York and Pennsylvania now, or at least in my mind, he is. So those were the early years of what George B. Vashon's work was about, what he learned and saw from his father, John, and the path he set on, where abolitionists were lawyer, writer, and of course an educator on many different ways. That was really the work of his life.
That's really amazing. So I think hearing you say that, that going back, so posthumously admitting George Vashon to the Pennsylvania bar, it recorded him as the first African American to practice law in the state of Pennsylvania. So I think I find that really.
I guess I don't know if that is technically true, but
I think that's,
he was not allowed to. They weren't letting Blacks pass the bar at the time. So this is 1847. Presumably, that means there were no other Black lawyers at the time. There were very few. I mean, it's not like there were a lot of Black lawyers in the country. I mean, when he passed the bar in New York, I don't know for certain. And then he later was admitted to the Supreme Court bar. I mean, I'm guessing this is a single digits kind of a thing in terms of who was actually the first Black lawyer. I know it was not George B. Vashon, but it was some contemporary of his.
Yeah. So that's amazing. So thank you for sharing all of that history. And I just wanted to touch base a little bit about the businesses, the city baths that John B. Vashon and his barber shop. And we you brought up a couple of our collaborators at the time period as well, and some of the names that some Pittsburghers know, maybe a little bit more popular in speaking about is Martin Delaney, who I know was mentored by John Vashon. So I found that really interesting, and that he lived and resided with the family for a period of time.
Yeah. He was about, I think he was born in 1812. So he was about 10 or 12 years younger than George B. Vashon, but they were sort of peers effectively. And the two of them got access to some of the same educational resources at the time. But yeah, Martin Delaney was in the Vashon household. And what's interesting is he was a strong proponent, certainly an abolitionist, but strong proponent of Blacks colonizing African countries. And that was that was certainly a major departure point for Martin Delaney and the Vashons. So irrespective of their very close friendship, family connection, he lived with them. That was sort of just one of those bright lines between them philosophically that was a big difference.
Yes, thank you for bringing that up. So, any wisdom that you'd like to share, or things that you might instill in the generations going forward, some values or lessons learned that you'd like them to take into the future?
Yeah, well, I think one thing that's fascinating and important to appreciate when you try to, assess the work and the legacy of so many Black Americans in the time that the Vashons were living, and I think this is reflective in their lives, that, you're not going to find you're not going to find every notable person in the movement of the time written about in a history book. There are places where I have seen and read and myself written about George B. Vashon and added to some of the research that I found when I was growing up. But certainly there are names more common: Frederick Douglass, Harriet Tubman. I mentioned William Lloyd Garrison. But I think oftentimes history isn't always going to be as discerning as the facts at the time probably bear out, which is there were many more people. Sometimes people get their work conflated into more well-known names. And so I share this just to say that there are a lot of people very similar to the Vashons whose names aren't as well-known that should be. And I think part of what I've really been committed to doing as much as possible, both because it's enriching for me and my family to, focus attention on the contributions and legacy of the Vashons, but also it's important to tell the story. Because it's not always going to be apparent to the naked eye. The other piece I think is important to acknowledge is that there really were many different ways that Blacks at the time had to advance the cause of Black equality. And it wasn't necessarily, there were many channels denied Blacks, right? I mean, that I mentioned George B. Vashon couldn't become a lawyer at the time. So there were many things that blocked paths that he was trying to move forward on. Certainly elected office was not something until the 1850s and 60s, really, that Blacks could achieve. So there were non-traditional ways that Blacks had to advance key initiatives, whether it was the written word, the spoken word, sort of the whole abolitionist crusade. It's frankly, it's a non-traditional set of tactics that were used to free slaves, and the collective efforts were so important to see, because it's not as though there was not work going on that impacted the law or politics, but Blacks were denied the opportunity to be agents in that. And so they had to work around it and through it and create the ability to participate in those types of forums. And those were ways that I think you can see in the Vashons and so many other Black Americans at the time, where you had to sort of create the opportunity to be able to advance equality, but it wasn't necessarily as straightforward as you might see in today's society, in terms of, okay, well, you could be a judge, or you could be a lawyer, you could be, all those were obstacles, or the lack of access to those traditional channels were obstacles, and yet they found ways to, especially through education, to make sure that doors were open for more Black Americans. And I think that's the final point I might underscore, is that it's hard to assess the real legacy of George B. Vashon in this case by only looking at what he did, but he was one of the first, probably 3 or 4 Black college professors. And so teaching, and he was a founder of Howard University, local to Pittsburgh. He was president of Avery College. He died when he was teaching at the Alcorn State University in Mississippi. And so the way that he shaped the next generation and generations of Black Americans through educational opportunities where he taught and helped launch different universities at the time, that was a real major contribution in his life that certainly passed down in the lives of the people that he helped help educate and open up those doors for.
Right. So mentorship, I'm hearing, the themes that come up with the family name and the legacy that they've contributed to come forward and laid this foundation for our contemporary partners and collaborators today in education and activism and the arts, right? So I'm interested in anything more you want to share about that.
Yeah, and I think some of it also is the collective effort often at the time, whether it was looking at how organizations that were formalized. For example, there was George B. Vashon started the Pittsburgh Juvenile Education Society. A lot of the work came through actual organized groups. My grandmother, Frances Vashon Atkinson, was one of the founders of the Links. And this is an organization that is, perhaps the premier organization of sort of service, philanthropy, and community that Black women are members of. And even through other organizations, my ancestors, I'm a Mason. And I think looking to not just the actual collective effort of individuals in some group, but it is what is the ability to leverage organizations to move the ball forward on multiple fronts. That's something that I think we see through the work of many of the anti-slavery societies. In my research on George B. Vashon, there were frequently meetings, conventions through the 1840s, 50s, and 60s designed around abolitionist work. And these formal organizations and conferences and conventions, it was that collective gathering where you often saw, George B. Vashon as corresponding secretary, and he would sort of use his power with the written word to capture the ideals of those around him. But it was that coming together that really galvanized many in the abolitionist movement, and certainly George B. Vashon, but also to collectively figure out ways to sustain in communities educational opportunities and then social service opportunities that many really looked to formal organizations and created those to do so.
I thought it was fascinating that, the work and the obstacles that he overcame to become a lawyer and teaching practice and starting his own practice in Syracuse, New York, and then going to the Supreme Court and traveling, his curiosity and his passion for the revolutionary spirit, and going to Haiti and then coming back again, bringing his knowledge and experience here to Pittsburgh. I just found that also fascinating. But then redirecting where he could make a large contribution and where he was still really wanting to empower the youth and in education, excuse me. So I thought that was a fascinating point. And to go to the women in your family, also making mention of Susan Vashon, who was George's wife, and her work in education and community service as well.
Yeah. Susan Paul Smith, she descended from very accomplished people as well in the Boston, Massachusetts area. Her grandfather was well-known Reverend Nathan Paul at the time. She and George B. Vashon met when he was principal of the colored schools in Pittsburgh area, and she was a teacher there. And so this was the 18, I guess it was probably
1950 almost.
1840s,
Yeah.
late 40s, early
Hmm.
50s.
Hmm.
And they met and started a family. But yeah, she was in her own right a very accomplished person. There's actually I work today in Washington D.C. and I remember couple of years after I started working in the area, D.C. area, after I finished college. Around the corner from me, I went to a elementary school. It was called Stevens well, I guess middle school, Stevens Elementary and Middle School. Anyway, she was a principal there.
Yeah.
And so when, they lived in Pittsburgh for a number of years, and about the um, early 1850s, he moved to Syracuse, New York, and they were there till about 1857, 58. And they moved back to Pittsburgh, and then they moved to Washington, D.C. And that's where he was active, working at the Freedmen's Bureau after the Civil War, but also he met General O.O. Howard, who was a Civil War general, ran the Freedmen's Bureau. President Lincoln had him run the Freedmen's Bureau. And then afterwards, he decided he would leave the Freedmen's Bureau, and he brought George B. Vashon with him to start a college for Black Americans, and that was Howard University.
Right.
And so there were times when they moved from different communities a decent amount. And frankly, part of that was, as accomplished as George B. Vashon was, he met with a lot of discrimination. And also the work that he was doing, for example, with his law offices in Syracuse, it's not like this was lucrative work, helping slaves get free. That's not that wasn't the money maker. If you were looking to actually, try to make significant salary out of your legal work. It wasn't going to be in that path, but that's what he wanted to do. But it was not something that could be sustained. And so either for financial reasons, when he was in Syracuse, he took in the children of his sister, Mary Frances. She had died, and her husband was not able to care for them. So he took in, I think, three of her children. So he had a family of seven children while they were in Washington, D.C., and things were very difficult for him. And I think he certainly tried to pursue various positions, and didn't always those didn't all work out. So as much as he had a life of pretty significant accomplishment and achievement, he was also himself very clearly, a victim of discrimination. And so he had to, at different times, pivot and look to move to places where there were opportunities. I think there were a couple of jobs he looked to pursue in the DC area, and I don't think they were necessarily, they perhaps didn't amount too much. And so after some years working at Howard University, he went down to Mississippi. One of the two senators, Mississippi had two Black senators after the Civil War, U.S. senators, and one of them was friends with George B. Vashon, and that Senator Hiram Revels went down to Mississippi to be president of Alcorn State, and he brought George B. Vashon down to be a teacher there, and that's where he died. So that's sort of at least the some of the ways that some of the areas where they lived and what they did there. But Susan Paul Vashon was an accomplished educator herself, and did a lot, especially in the Pittsburgh area during the Civil War years, to help with the sort of relief effort for so many soldiers who were needing assistance and help. So beyond just education, she was very active in the community during the Civil War years, and continued that when she moved after George B. Vashon's death in Mississippi from yellow fever. She moved her family out to St. Louis. And did a lot of things in the sort of the club movement there, which was a sort of organized activities to help different ways that Blacks in the community helped advance cause education other opportunities in those communities, and she was a leader in that what was known as the club movement in the St. Louis area.
Great. And just going to mention, and because I know you touched on these a couple of places, but excuse me, John B. Vashon was an agent or a fiduciary financier of some of the abolitionist papers, and George Vashon contributed to these publications as a writer, and also was the corresponding secretary of the Anti-Slavery Society. I know he had some correspondence with President Lincoln, and there were others involved, but maybe you could speak to that a little bit.
Yeah. Well, John B. Vashon, I mentioned earlier how he had a lot of relationships with blacks and whites, well-to-do blacks and whites, both in Pittsburgh but beyond. And John B. Vashon was very close friends with William Lloyd Garrison, the noted white abolitionist. And William Lloyd Garrison was once in Boston, and a mob of sorts attacked him. He was a very controversial figure, I think, did amazing work, but any leading voice on abolitionists causes, black or white, open themselves up to danger. And so there was a time when he was actually William Lloyd Garrison was put in a jail in Boston to protect him from a mob, and he lost his hat. And John B. Vashon brought him a new hat the next day in jail. And they had a lot of correspondence between the two of them. But yeah, John B. Vashon provided a lot of funding to the Liberator, which was Garrison's newspaper, and was the top funder of that in Pittsburgh, which at the time it was very, very critical asset for the anti-slavery movement. Similarly, George B. Vashon wrote for Frederick Douglass's The North Star. He did a number of articles that he signed with the last three initials of his names, ERN, George Boyer Vashon. And the contribution that I think you can see, this kind of goes back to an earlier point, how blacks had to find different ways to advance different causes. But George B. Vashon, very much the written and spoken word, was a differentiating contribution for him. He penned an open letter to President Grant talking about making the case for the 13th, 14th, 15th Amendments, trying to, President Lincoln, trying to sort of frame out the arguments there. He subsequently added another letter to other, sort of open letters to the public on different topics. But yeah, that was very much a way that the two of them made sure that they got their voice out.
Is there anything else you would cover today? I appreciate you spending time with us and introducing your family.
Well, I'll tell you this. For me, my excitement and sort of stimulation in family history started when I was a little boy. We would visit my grandmother, as I mentioned, either at her house in Bryn Mawr, Pennsylvania, or we would go to a place on the Jersey Shore. And I had, at an early age, watched Roots, and really was captivated by the story, but frankly, the way that Alex Haley traced back. And, like many people inspired by that, at the time, I asked my grandmother questions about where we came from, who we were. And it didn't take much to kind of prompt her to share with me sort of the first information I heard about George B. Vashon. And she was alive when George B. Vashon's widow, Susan Paul Vashon, was still alive. George B. Vashon died in 1878. My grandmother was born in 1912. But her grandmother died, maybe a year or two after she was born. Anyway, so there was some overlap. But the stories she shared with me at an early age, kind of talking with me about the firsts and inspired me to trace back a little further, but also to shine a spotlight. And so I was excited this summer. My family and I went to Ireland. My seven greats grandfather was Simon Vashon, who was a mayor of Waterford, Ireland. And he had a son, also Simon Vashon, who was the mayor, and they came over to the U.S. To the colonies probably in about 1740 or 1750, and that's where our line descends from. And so tracing back that far is certainly something that has really been the passion of my life. But it's also, we all have different stories of where we came from, but we don't always ask those who are still alive to tell us those stories. The internet today is a tool that I didn't have when I started doing my research, but certainly in encouraging all folks, black, white, whatever, who is the oldest person in your family alive today, and figure out ways, if this is something that speaks to you the way it did to me, prompt them with some questions. You never know what you might find out, but I'm now really kind of 40 plus years into my family search, and it's the thing that is most exciting to me.
Yeah, the stories carrying forward. I think that's so important. So we have to preserve the history, right? And we have to know where we're from, and we have to, hopefully be excited about those things and share that with our communities.
Absolutely. And I'm looking forward to, I'm hoping this summer there'll be an unveiling of one of the Pennsylvania Commission on History and Museums approved a historical marker for George B. Vashon that's going to be located at 3rd and Market Streets in downtown Pittsburgh, right across the street from Martin Delaney, who has a marker already. And I had seen the Martin Delaney marker about, 20 or so years ago. And it occurred to me that, I think George B. Vashon should have one. So thankfully, the commission agreed with me on that, and were kind enough to approve the application and grant it. So I'll be excited in the months ahead to be there for the locating of the marker, which will help to also put a spotlight on literally on George B. Vashon and his years in Pittsburgh.
I look forward to being part of that. I hope we can have a nice ribbon cutting for that event. And I welcome everybody to join us for the rest of Black History Month in February 2026. Thank you for speaking with us today.
Yeah, thanks so much, Christine.